ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
नारायणं नमस्कृत्य
नारायणं नमस्कृत्य
नरं चैव नरोत्तमं
नरं चैव नरोत्तमं
देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं
देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं
ततो जयमुदीरये।
ततो जयमुदीरये।
नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु
नष्टप्रायेषु भद्रेषु
नित्यं भागवत सेवया
नित्यं भागवतसेवया
भगवती उत्तमा श्लोके
भगवती उत्तमश्लोके
भक्तिर्भक्तिनैष्टिकी।
भक्तिर्भक्तिनैष्टिकी।
Reading from Bhagavad Gita as it is, chapter 9, most confidential knowledge, text number 1. श्री भगवान उवाच।
श्री भगवान उवाच।
इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यत् ज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात् श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात्। श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्। श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्।
श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्। श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्।
श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञान सहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्। श्री भगवान उवाच। इदं तु ते गुह्यतमं प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे sahitam
ज्ञानविज्ञानसहितं
ज्ञात्वा मोक्षस्य शुभात्
यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्
श्रीभगवानुवाच
श्रीभगवानुवाच
ते तु पुण्यतमम्
इदं तु ते पुण्यतमम्
वक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे
प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे
विज्ञानसहितम्
ज्ञानविज्ञानसहितं
ज्ञात्वा मोक्ष्यसे शुभात्
यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्
श्रीभगवानुवाच
श्रीभगवानुवाच
इदं तु ते गुह्यतमम्
इदं तु ते गुह्यतमम्
प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे
प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे
ज्ञानं विज्ञानसहितं
ज्ञानविज्ञानसहितं
यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात्
ज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्
श्रीभगवानुवाच
श्रीभगवानुवाच
इदं तु
इदं तु
ते गुह्यतमम्
ते गुह्यतमम्
प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे
प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानविज्ञानसहितं
यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे शुभात्
यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात्
online श्रीभगवानुवाच
इदं तु ते गुह्यतमम् प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञानसहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात्
श्रीभगवानुवाच
श्रीभगवानुवाच इदं तु ते गुह्यतमम् प्रवक्ष्यामि अनसूयवे ज्ञानं विज्ञानसहितं यज्ञात्वा मोक्षसे अशुभात्
श्रीभगवानुवाच
श्रीभगवानुवाच
The Supreme Personality of Godhead said,
The Supreme Personality of Godhead said,
Idam,
Idam,
this,
this,
to,
but
te,
unto you,
Guhyadamam,
Guhyatamam,
most confidential,
most confidential,
Pravakshami,
Pravakshami,
I am speaking,
Anusuyave,
Anusuyave, non-envious,
to the non-envious,
Jnanam,
Jnana,
knowledge,
knowledge,
Vijnana,
Vijnana,
realized knowledge,
realized knowledge,
Sahitam,
Sahitam,
with,
Yad,
which,
Jnatva,
knowing,
Mokshase,
be released,
Ashubhat,
from this miserable material existence. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation. The Supreme Lord said, My dear Arjuna, because you are never envious of me, I shall impart to you this most secret wisdom, knowing which you shall be relieved of the miseries of material existence. Translation with repetition. The Supreme Lord said, My dear Arjuna, because you are never envious of me, I shall impart to you this most secret wisdom, knowing which you shall be relieved of the miseries of material existence. Krishna Prabhupada. As the devotee hears more and more for the Supreme Lord, he becomes enlightened. This hearing process is recommended in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Messages of the Supreme Personality of Godhead are full of potencies. And these potencies can be realized if topics regarding the Supreme Godhead are discussed amongst devotees. This cannot be achieved by the association of mental speculators or academic scholars, for it is realized knowledge. The devotees are constantly engaged in Supreme Lord's service. The Lord understands the mentality and sincerity of a particular living entity who is engaged in Krishna consciousness and gives him the intelligence to understand the science of Krishna, the association of devotees. Discussion of Krishna is very potent, and if a fortunate person has such association and tries to assimilate the knowledge, then he will surely make advancement towards spiritual realization. Lord Krishna, in order to encourage Arjuna to higher and higher elevation in his potent service, describes in this 9th chapter matters more confidential than any he has already disclosed. The very beginning of Bhagavad Gita, the first chapter, is more or less an introduction to the rest of the book. And in the 2nd and 3rd chapter, the spiritual knowledge described is called confidential. Topics discussed in the 7th and 8th chapters are specifically related to devotional service, and because they bring enlightenment in Krishna consciousness, they are called more confidential. But the matters which are described in the 9th chapter deal with unalloyed pure devotion. Therefore, this is called the most confidential. One who is situated in the most confidential knowledge of Krishna is naturally transcendental. He therefore has no material pangs, although he is in the material world. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, it is said that although one who has a sincere desire to render loving service to the Supreme Lord is situated in the conditional state of material existence, he is to be considered liberated. Similarly, we shall find in the Bhagavad Gita, 10th chapter, that anyone who is engaged in that way is a liberated person. Now, this first verse has specific significance. Knowledge, idam jnanam, refers to pure devotional service, which consists of 9 different activities: hearing, chanting, remembering, serving, worshipping, praying, obeying, maintaining friendship, and surrendering everything. By the practice of these 9 elements of devotional service, one is elevated to spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness. At that time, when one's heart is cleared of the material contamination, one can understand the science of Krishna. Simply to understand that a living entity is not material is not sufficient. That may be the beginning of spiritual realization. But one should recognize the difference between activities of the body and spiritual activities by which one understands that he is not the body. In the 7th chapter, we have already discussed the opulent potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his different energies, the inferior and superior natures, and all this material manifestation. Now, in chapters 9 and 10, the glories of the Lord will be delineated. The Sanskrit word anusuyave in this verse is also very significant. Generally, the commentators, even if they are highly scholarly, are all envious of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Even the most erudite scholars write in Bhagavad Gita very inaccurately because they are envious of Krishna. Their commentaries are useless. The commentaries given by devotees of the Lord are bona fide. No one can explain Bhagavad Gita or give perfect knowledge of Krishna if he is envious. One who criticizes the character of Krishna without knowing him is a fool. So such commentaries should be very carefully avoided. For one who understands that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the pure and transcendental personality, these chapters will be very beneficial. Thus ends the Transcendental Bhaktivedanta Purport. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnananjanashlakaya Chakshurunvedam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Vashyatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we are almost close to the halfway in studying Bhagavad Gita systematically, week after week. And this week we are studying chapter 9, which is called the most confidential knowledge. So, in the last verse of chapter 8, attaining the Supreme, we saw the Lord describing how one who practices devotional service can obtain the Supreme Abode, and how practicing devotional life is practicing devotional life means also getting all the benefits of practicing all the studies of Vedas, performing sacrifices, performing austerities, giving charities, and all other processes encompassed together, whatever the benefits one may obtain, all those benefits are obtained in devotional life. So, and even more so, the benefit of devotional service is that one also reaches the Supreme Abode. So that was the conclusion in the last chapter. Now, Lord is further elaborating on the principle of devotional service, which he briefly mentions in the 8th chapter, in the 14th verse, unalloyed devotional service, and then further carrying that principle of unalloyed devotional service, the Lord explains in this chapter more elaborately on the principle of unalloyed devotional service. So already in the 8th chapter, 14th verse, God says, Ananya Chetaha Satadam, Yomam Smarti Nityasaha, Tasyaham Sulabha Partha, Nitya Yuktasya Yoginaha. So Lord is already stating here that one who remembers Bharati, the Lord always, Nitya, without deviation. For one who is remembering the Lord always, Lord is very easy to be obtained. Tasyam Sulabha Partha. So there's constant engagement of devotional service, the always rendering service to the Lord. If one is performing this constant unalloyed devotional service, then Lord is easily obtainable. So that principle was already explained in the 14th verse of last chapter. Now, starting this chapter, Lord is further elaborating on this idea of what is unalloyed devotional service. And so this verse, Lord himself is speaking, and here he is saying, Shri Bhagavan Vacha. Interestingly, Srila Prabhupada, he gave 2 lectures on this verse, and in both the times, Srila Prabhupada emphasizes on this word Bhagavan. So he begins with explaining what the word Bhagavan means. This is very important for various commentators on Bhagavad Gita try to interpret Bhagavad Gita in various ways. And Srila Prabhupada, to enlighten us on the supreme position of Krishna, again and again, whenever the word Bhagavan comes, Srila Prabhupada explains it very elaborately. In fact, he goes on to explain this word itself for maybe like 10-15 minutes. So we'll briefly look into this word, Bhagavan, and just to keep in mind that this chapter is talking about unalloyed devotion. And beginning this verse, we will see how that principle of unalloyed devotion is being emphasized by the Lord himself. So, Srila Prabhupada, as soon as the word Bhagavan comes, Srila Prabhupada is always very eager to explain this word so that we all can understand what it means and not carried away by the impersonal explanations given by various Mayavadis or various envious commentators, as Prabhupada says. So, Krishna is full of 6 opulences. Aishwaryasya, Samagrasya, Vidyasya, Yashasha, Shriya, Jnana, Vairagya. So these 6 qualities are present, the 6 opulences. That is Aishwarya, wealth, Samagrasya, and completeness, Vidyasya, full of strength, Yashasha, fame, Shriya, beauty, Jnana, full of knowledge, and Vairagya, renunciation. So Prabhupada says that if one is possessing all these attributes in completeness, samagrasya, in fullness, then one is said to be the Supreme Person. And that is the definition of the Lord. And Prabhupada always gives various examples to illustrate this point, that you take some person, he may be a rich person in New York, he may be a rich person in India, but he cannot say he possesses all the wealth. Similarly, no one can say he possesses all the knowledge. And no one can say he has got everlasting fame and complete fame. No. But Prabhupada gives various examples to illustrate how Lord Krishna has all the six opulences in full. So, Bhoktaram Yagna Tapasam, Sarvaloka Maheshwaram, the Supreme Lord is the proprietor of everything in existence. He is full of knowledge. He is Satchitananda Vigraha. He is pure knowledge, complete knowledge. And as we see, his opulence, as also seen in the Krishna book, various unlimited opulence. And we can also hear about his opulence in the spiritual kingdom, where everything is made of touchstone. There are millions and millions of Lakshmis who are serving the Lord. And there are Surabhi cows, desire fulfilling trees. So the opulence of the Lord is unlimited. So, and therefore, no one is greater than him or equal to him, because he is the only one who possesses all the six opulences in completeness. And Srila Prabhupada also goes on to explain that the example or the explanation given by Srila Rupa Goswami. So sometimes when we think of Krishna, one way to compare Krishna is with the common people, but then Rupa Goswami also explains Krishna and the differences of Lord Krishna with respect to other Vishnu Tattvas, other incarnations of the Lord. So in that explanation, Rupa Goswami says that Krishna possesses 64 qualities. He is Shatpurna Aishwarya, and he has got this 64 qualities in full, in completeness. Whereas the other Vishnu Tattvas, they possess these qualities in 60 in number. So even with respect to the other Vishnu avatars, Vishnu Tattva avatars, Rama, Narasimha, Krishna is still superior. For he manifests the 64 qualities in fullness. Whereas the other Vishnu Tattvas, they can exhibit 60 qualities. And similarly, Rupa Goswami also compares how the number of qualities that Shiva can possess, Brahma can possess, and the living entity can possess in completeness are much lesser than what the Lord in Swayam Bhagavan Rupa of Sri Krishna can exhibit. And therefore, this specific aspect of who we are worshipping, who is the actual object of worship, and why he is worshipped, what are his qualities, what are his characteristics, are very well described by the Acharyas, especially Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, to establish the position of Sri Krishna. And therefore, Prabhupada always emphasizes on this word Bhagavan and explains it in great detail. Prabhupada also explains the word Bhagavan from Krishna's to Bhagavan Swayam, from this verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, where in the third chapter, first canto, various incarnations of the Lord are described. The incarnations of Lord Balarama and Lord Krishna are also explained in this chapter. Therefore, one may confuse that all these incarnations are maybe of one kind. But then the author also mentions Krishna's to Bhagavan Swayam. But Ete Chamsa Kalapumsa. So all these incarnations, they are either plenary or parts of plenary expansions of the Lord. But of which Lord? The Bhagavan Swayam is Sri Krishna. So Prabhupada gives various references to establish that Krishna is the original personality of Godhead, the Bhagavan Swayam, who has got all six opulences, possesses 64 qualities in full, and so on and so forth, to explain that we are receiving knowledge from Sri Krishna. And therefore, Prabhupada says, Sri Bhagavan Uvacha. So whom are we hearing from? We are hearing from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And as we know, there is as we just discussed, he possesses all six opulences in full. wealth, fame, strength, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. We should know that he is Krishna, God, and that nothing is equal to or greater than him. There is nothing superior to be conceived. He is a supreme person. So Prabhupada always established the supremacy of Lord Krishna. And this is the nature of a devotee. A devotee always wants to glorify the Lord and establish the position of the Lord. So this is the first point that we can understand from this verse, that the Lord himself is speaking, and Bhagavan is a one who has got all these great opulences in full, and he has all the 64 qualities. Now, the second word Prabhupada explains in his lectures is that of this word Guhyatamam. Idam tute Guhyatamam. So, Idam, Gnanam, this knowledge, is characterized by this one term called confidential, or sorry, most confidential here, Guhyatamam. So, Prabhupada also mentions that Guhya, confidential, Guhyatara, more confidential, and Guhyatamam, the most confidential. So, also in the purport, Prabhupada explains how different chapters of Bhagavad Gita are giving different aspects of knowledge which are confidential, more confidential, and most confidential. The second and third chapter of Bhagavad Gita, which talk more explicitly about the soul, the nature of the soul, so that constitutes to be the confidential knowledge. In fact, it is not possible for one to understand this confidential knowledge of one being the spirit soul, Aham Brahmasmi, is a very difficult subject matter to understand, because by no experiment one can understand that one is spirit soul. And it is beyond the empirical observation that one can make that one can understand that I am different from this matter altogether. Because we are in this body and we are staying here for so long, we forget that we have a different identity from this body. Therefore, sometimes imagine someone is staying in the car for so many years and he has never left the car. From the time he is born till the time he's going to die, let's say he's in the same car. So naturally, he will think that this car and me are part and parcel together. So similarly, as we are in this body for so many millions and millions of births, and we continue to live in this body, it is sometimes difficult for us to understand that it is not me, but it is a vehicle that is covering me. So even to understand this knowledge is very confidential. It's very, very difficult. And therefore, we need to learn this knowledge from the Vedas or from the spiritual master. Unless we don't hear this knowledge from Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, we can never understand this simple confidential knowledge that I am not this body. So even to understand that, to come to the platform of Brahmabhuta, be free from this modes of material nature, and to realize oneself to be Brahman or a spirit soul is very, very hard knowledge to obtain. And this can be only obtained by the mercy of Guru Krishna through the scriptures. So that is explained in the very beginning of second and third chapters of Bhagavad Gita. Then Prabhupada explains that the more confidential knowledge is explained in 7th and 8th chapters. So what is that more confidential knowledge? It is once one understands that, okay, I'm not spirit soul, I'm not this body, I'm spirit soul, one also needs to understand who is the Supreme Lord, where am I coming from? Because we don't exist in vacuum, we exist in the existence of the Lord. We exist with the Lord. Our existence is not independent of the Lord. So just knowing me or oneself to be different from the matter is not sufficient. One must also understand who is that supreme source from which I'm coming. What is this existence? The more confidential knowledge, as we see in Bhagavad Gita 7th and 8th chapters, the nature of Krishna consciousness and the glories of the Lord are further described in that chapters. So the Lord, as how he is Matta Parataram Kanyam, Kinchit Asti Dhananjaya. So how the absolute truth is the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna. And how he possesses different energies, both material and spiritual energies. and how that manifests in different ways in the world is described. And then his abode is described, how that is different from the material world. So all these constitutes more confidential knowledge, because in other words, unless one does not recognize one's relationship with the Lord or understands the position of the Lord, one will never know what one should do. Even if I'm understanding I'm spirit soul, what should I do after I understand I'm spirit soul? It's not very clear. But as one understands that the Supreme Lord is, there's no one greater than Him, He is the absolute truth. And I'm a part and parcel of Him, I'm Anu, He is Vibhu. So that is more confidential. And then once one understands, okay, the position of the Lord is so supreme, so great, then the most confidential knowledge, as we see in this chapter that we discussed, is that of the unalloyed devotional service. Unalloyed devotional service means devotional service can also be performed in the mode of goodness, mode of passion, and mode of ignorance. In the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is description about the various kinds of devotional service that can be performed in these three different modes. There can be devotional service in the mode of enviousness, pride, anger, and so on and so forth. That constitutes devotional service in mode of passion, mode of ignorance. So again, there are categories in which one can render devotional service. But the highest category of the highest kind of devotional service is that of unalloyed devotional service. Unalloyed devotional service means there is no exterior motive behind performing devotional service. It is very difficult to obtain unalloyed devotional service, for there is some motive behind devotional service also. It can be gross benefits sometimes, or it can be subtle benefits. The subtle benefits could include lava, puja, pratishtha. So there is a certain sense of proving oneself to be superior through devotional service, to reinforce the idea of doership even more, that in devotional service I am doing more. So the material, gross or subtle contaminations of material life can also creep into the performance of devotional service. And therefore, it is important that one understands what is unalloyed devotional service and how and why it is to be performed. And therefore, Lord is further explaining in this chapter how that most confidential or most pure unalloyed devotional service is what is most dear to the Lord. In fact, it is said that only when one understands that my motive of doing pure unalloyed devotional service is only my constitutional position. It is not another motive. It's my original position to render unalloyed devotional service. And therefore, I have to render unalloyed devotional service. So when devotional service is rendered only to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then it is said to be unalloyed devotional service. Prabhupada, in one of the purports, adds one more layer to this meaning of not only to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but to please on the order of the spiritual master or under the guidance of the spiritual master is considered to be pure devotional service. So devotional service also cannot be whimsical. It is not that anything and everything the Lord will be pleased with in the name of devotional service. No, it is not like that. If our goal is to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then it is important to take the instructions from the bona fide representatives of the Supreme Lord. Because without knowing the instructions of the bona fide representatives of the Supreme Lord, we will not know how to please the Lord. We will concoct our different ways to please the Lord. But on the other hand, if we actually understand this secret, the most confidential elements of what pleases the Supreme Lord and how to execute that service from a pure representative of the Lord, then our devotional service will blossom like anything. And we will see the result of such kind of devotional service. It will enthuse us more and more. It will enliven our heart with greater spiritual enlightenment, knowledge, and happiness and bliss, and so on and so forth. So this is most confidential, and the Lord is also explaining this verse why this most confidential knowledge is being given to Arjuna. That we'll see a little later, but this confidential knowledge is not easily obtainable. It is very rarely obtained. For even it is confidential for the reason we will see the Lord is explaining why this confidential knowledge is not revealed to the people otherwise, which we'll see a little later. And this is a very important word to keep in mind. Then the other word that Prabhupada also explains in this lecture is that of Jnanam Vijnana. Jnanam Vijnana Sahitam. So Prabhupada explains that Prabhupada gives the example of a BSc science lab, and Prabhupada says just like there is theory and practice that you have to perform in order to get grades in the class, similarly in spiritual life also there is theory and practice. So as we saw in the yesterday's verse also, Prabhupada says that studying Vedas is not to make armchair philosophers. Yeah, the purpose of studying Vedas is to build character. And similarly, Prabhupada also explains that the understanding of spiritual knowledge is not that one goes on reading books and books and books, but the person will be tested how much are you able to apply that principles in real life. How much one is able to demonstrate theoretical learnings in the practical applications of daily life is equally important. In fact, more important. So Prabhupada gives various examples, and he says just like Sarva Dharman Parityaja Mam Ekam Sharanam Vraja. So this principle may be understood theoretically by many people, but how to apply that into practice? So unless that knowledge of how to apply the principles of devotional life in practice is not understood, then it becomes just a dry philosophy. That is not sufficient. And therefore, always it is important to also recognize with the theoretical knowledge one possesses how much one is able to apply that in practice. And Prabhupada explains in different ways, in different places, how that the practice can be strengthened. How one can move from this theory, just understanding theoretical aspects to practical aspects, which we'll see just in a while. So before we see how that theory can become more easy to apply in practice, can anyone state what is the common thing between the sky and the ear?
Both are mediums of sound. I mean, both are vectors of sound.
Both of them accept something like ear accept ear sound, sky accepts the cold and the warm.
Slightly closer, not as close.
Helps us by allowing us to see illumination of the sun. Likewise, the ears help us by allowing us to see the illumination of spiritual sound.
Yes, so there are many different things that we can state about this, but in one of the purpose in Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada uses this analogy to describe the significance of hearing. So it's a very nice analogy Prabhupada makes here. Prabhupada says, just like in space, you can fill the space with any number of objects and still you cannot fill it. You can accept as many objects as you can fill. Similarly, Prabhupada says the ears can receive as much vibration as you can send. So usually when you fill something in a room, you will not find more space to put in. But it is not the case with the sky. It is unlimited. Similarly, the ear, it does not stop one from receiving the vibration just because you send some vibration. So there is unlimited vibration that can be sent to the ears. So we cannot take unlimited food into our mouth. It is limited. But the amount of vibrations that can go into the ear is unlimited. And Prabhupada says, therefore, this process of hearing is very, very special. So what kind of vibration we send in is up to us, and that we have to do in a specific way so as to actually benefit of sending this unlimited vibration into our ears. And how is that is done? So that Prabhupada in the very beginning of the first paragraph of Prabhupada explains by quoting this verse, Satam prasangan mama virya samvido bhavati hrit karna prasayana katha tad joshanad asu apuvaka vartamani shraddha ratin bhakti anukramishati. So when we want to put the right vibration into our ears, how is that to be done? How that should be done? So that is being described here. So this aspect of transferring the theoretical knowledge to practice or to the practical realization of the knowledge becomes more potent in the association, prasangan, the association of the devotee, satam. So this is the characteristics of a devotee. So even when Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was asked, what is the characteristic of a Vaishnava? He says, Asat Sangha Tyagi E Vaishnava. So Asat Sangha, so there are two things, Asat and Sat. Sat means who are interested in the topics of eternity or absolute truth. Asat means who are interested in the topics of temporariness of this material world. So who are we associating with? And as we associate, what we do is that we hear from them various things. That means we develop different ideas and thoughts from them. So if one is associating with Asat Sangha means who are interested in material opulences or who is interested in women, and or Krishna Bhakta, who is not interested in to become a devotee of the Lord. So when we associate with these category of people, as we hear from them, we kind of associate with their thoughts and philosophies. But on the other hand, when we associate with the devotees, so what is the characteristic of devotee? They're always glorifying the Lord. So when we are associating with the devotees of the Lord, naturally the things that we hear is the transcendental vibration of the Shastra, and therefore, and especially, this knowledge has to be obtained from realized souls. The knowledge that is being talked about, the most confidential knowledge, is can be obtained only in the association or by the mercy of a pure devotee. And therefore, when in the association of pure devotees, Prabhupada is writing Satam as pure devotees, discussion of the pastimes and activities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is very pleasing and satisfying to the ear and the heart. So, in this purport, Prabhupada explains that the word potency is a very nice word. So when we see potency, and there is another word called energy. So these two words look very similar. Sometimes we can think that these two words can be interchanged. But actually, potency has a very subtle nuance to the meaning, that potency refers to the energy that is possessed by a person, which is, it has a personal connotation. So there is a release of energy. The person can choose to release potency. I may have the potency to do something, but I can release it when I want. But energy is something like an impersonal idea. It does not necessarily mean that there is a possessor of the energy. So this word potency is very important. And here it is said that the Krishna Katha is full of potency. But in the association of devotees, but in the association of the devotees, when this is heard, it is released. It becomes much more manifest. So the process of strengthening this knowledge is to discuss in the association of devotees. And that is even more pleasing, satisfying, and that knowledge becomes practical very easily. Therefore, this as again and again Prabhupada mentions that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness that Srila Prabhupada has founded is to give an opportunity for devotees to come together and to hear these glories of the Supreme Lord and chant together, so that that potency is released much more quickly, and that progress towards the path of liberation, Apavarga Vartamani, is made very quickly. And here, Prabhupada emphasized that point very significantly by saying that as a devotee hears more and more. So this hearing is not just a limited thing, as we saw, the ears can take an unlimited amount of vibration. So one has to hear more and more about the Supreme Lord. So this Krishna Katha has such great potency that simply by hearing, one becomes enlightened. And Prabhupada also, one of the wonderful aspects of Srila Prabhupada's lectures is that he describes each of these words, which sometimes may look very complex, in a very nice and succinct way. So when Prabhupada in one of the lectures on Bhagavad Gita explains the word enlightened, and he says, just like this bulb, when it is on, it is enlightened or lightened. And when it is not, it is darkened. Similarly, enlightened means when we recognize that I'm not this body, I'm not supposed to be part of this material world. I'm part of the Supreme Lord and I have to render service unto Him. So this knowledge, when it dawns upon the living entity, is enlightened. So that knowledge is very difficult for us to understand by just associating with the modes of material nature and the people around. We do not think we are not part of this world. We deeply engross ourselves thinking that we are part of this world. So, can you get the charger? So, therefore, Prabhupada is stating here that Lord, based upon the mentality and sincerity of a particular living entity, gives him intelligence to understand the signs of Krishna. So Prabhupada is saying that based upon one's mentality and sincerity, Lord gives one the opportunity and the ability to understand the signs of Krishna in the association of devotees. So Prabhupada is again emphasizing on this point that it is very important if you want to make rapid advancement in spiritual life. In fact, advancement in spiritual life, association of devotees is must. It cannot be without the association that one can make advancement. No, association of devotees is must. And in the end, as we see, Prabhupada also explains about what is the reason why one is not able to make progress or why one is not able to understand this confidential knowledge. And Lord uses this one word called anusuyave. The Sanskrit word anusuyave, this verse is also very significant. So Prabhupada translates the word anusuyave as to be non-envious. So basically, everyone in the material world is envious of the Supreme Lord, and therefore one is given an opportunity to experience a life away from the Lord in this material world to lord over. So the envy means that why should Lord be the only proprietor? Why I cannot be the proprietor? Why I cannot be the enjoyer? Why I cannot be the supreme friend of everyone? So when one wants to take the position of the Lord and one becomes envious of the position of the Lord, then one cannot understand this most confidential aspects of the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada explains that not only envious, but also people who are sensuous, who are too deeply engrossed in sensual activities, they also cannot understand the confidential subject matter. So Prabhupada says that once one takes a devotional service, one is hearing the devotional service, if one is not giving up the sensual gratification, then the progress will be slow. And or in fact, it's not possible to understand the science of Krishna. Prabhupada also says that the word Anusuyave not only refers that one is envious of the Supreme Lord, but one should also not be envious of the Vaishnavas. Because the Lord considers his devotees very, very dear. So if one is offensive or envious towards even his devotees, the Lord is not very pleased. So it is very important that this envious nature towards the Vaishnavas or towards the Lord is a great impediment in understanding the science of Krishna. So when Prabhupada also says the remedy to this envy is also Krishna conscious activities. If one is able to follow the instructions of the spiritual master under the regulative principles as given by the spiritual master, if one is following the principles in a gradual way, then one will be also able to overcome this tendency of enviousness. Because Prabhupada also uses this word envious to referring to all the commentators who write on Bhagavad Gita but who are not devotees. Prabhupada also cautioned all the devotees all the time not to hear the spiritual subject matter from those who are envious of Krishna. Because this potency is not released to understand Krishna if it is heard from Asat Sangha or from non-devotees or from those who are envious. As we were also hearing today's Bhagavatam class, the Bhagavad Gita, which is authored by some scholars, although they may be popular in some way, but they cannot make devotees of Krishna. Devotees of Krishna can only become, one can become when that message is heard from another pure devotee. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita is so important and so glorious, for it made hundreds and thousands and millions of devotees of Krishna, because it is filled with the potency. It purely glorifies the Lord. So when one hears the pure glories of the Lord, then the faith inside one's heart becomes strengthened. If one does not hear from a pure devotee of the Lord, if one is not hearing with submissive attitude and from a pure devotee of the Lord, then one's faith in the message of Bhagavad Gita, in the presence of the Lord, in surrendering to the Lord, does not come. The Shraddha does not come. So if Shraddha is not there, where is the question of Rati, Bhakti? That is very far off. So unless one is not hearing and therefore as devotees, we should be also careful as where do we hear from, even if it is Krishna Katha. Sometimes it looks with this popular internet these days, we can find so many sources of hearing Krishna Katha, but we must be also careful as where are we hearing from. And Prabhupada explains that for one who understands that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the pure and transcendental personality, this practice will be very beneficial. So unless one is not having this Shraddha, the basic understanding, at least theoretically, that the Supreme Lord is Sri Krishna, is transcendental, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, if that basic understanding is not there, then all these chapters will look very vague for them. They will not understand the principle of devotional service and the necessity to do that. But if one is able to understand that principle, then the gradual application of these principles will increase further faith and attachment and bhakti towards the Supreme Lord. So I'll stop here and see if there are any questions.